Hello and welcome to Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make our community tick. Well, I've just had the pleasure of meeting someone you're going to hear from today who spends her time studying the way that local governments and county governments tell us what they're up to.
Recording in progress.
Tell us what they're up to and what we can find out, what we can't, and why that matters. Is that a fair way to describe what you do?
I think so, yes.
Okay, but you'll tell us a little more here. Anya Nakhmurina, did I say it right? Okay, is an associate professor at School of Management at Yale, and she studied the word they use on their website is stewardship and information roles of municipal disclosures, particularly interested in cities' disclosures to understand decisions concerning climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Welcome, Anya, to Dateline New Haven. So nice to meet you.
It's so great to meet you, Paul. Super excited to be here.
Okay, so one thing we talked about is you have studied the impact and significance of legal notices. Local legal notices. Yes. What governments always had to take ads in newspapers. Remember newspapers?
I do remember. Sometimes I do read newspapers.
Yeah, me too. Actually, I get the print Times and Journal, but I work at an online only news outlet. And there used to be these things called legal notices, which are sometimes there still, where every time government was about to do something, they had to put it. If they were going to pass a law, they have to put it there. If they're going to have a hearing, they have to put it there. And actually, in the New Haven Independent, you'll see some legal notices. But Anya, you're concerned about legal notices. Tell me what the concern is you have and what you studied.
I want to take this opportunity to tell you that legal notices are still here. I don't think they're going away. The brief history of legal notices is this. The very first legal notice was printed in the UK in...
I'm sorry. We're not hearing you. There you go.
Okay. Should I start talking?
No, it's fine. You said the first legal notice ever was in the United Kingdom.
Yes, the first legal notice was in the Oxford Gazette in the United Kingdom. It was published about 50 years after the invention of the printing press that also facilitated sort of the use of newspapers. And about 100 years later, the US followed with a similar law. I mean, the very, very first meeting of the first Congress mandated that all federal governments and all entities of the federal governments publish legal notice every time they're about to do something substantial. They should publish it in a newspaper. It was the only way people could get information back then. And they should be published like 10 days in advance prior to the meeting. And the next year, the states followed, and since then, we have those laws that mandate that governments publish important information about what they're up to, what they're going to do. Are they going to increase taxes? Are they going to change zoning? Are they going to, hear a budget, make a budget meeting, stuff like that.
And we have it was a law before the legislature this year in Connecticut to no longer require governments to publish legal notices, but instead allow them to put it on their government websites.
I guess the legal notices should still be there, yes. But the law that didn't pass eventually did have in mind that the governments could put this information on their websites.
So what were you studying? What is your concern about legal notices? What's happening with legal notices that has you worried?
So the very first state to successfully pass a bill like that, and there's actually a lot of action nowadays regarding public notices. More than 8 states so far have introduced bills. Just not so far in 2026 have introduced bills like that.
To limit the requirement that you put them in a paper newspaper that nobody reads anymore.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And the argument in the very first state to successfully pass this law was Florida. And the law came into effect on the 1st of January 2023. So we're now setting 2026. So we now have enough data to evaluate the consequences of this law. The way that law was...
I'm going to ask you to get so close to the mic, you're almost touching it.
No.
Could you speak so close to the mic?
Okay.
Yeah, so you hear much better there.
Okay.
So you say in 2023, a law took effect in Florida that said you no longer have to put local government notices in a newspaper. You can put them on your government website.
Exactly.
So you've studied the impact of that.
I studied the impact of that.
Did that make everybody more informed now, and therefore DeSantis couldn't get away sneaking stuff through, or legislators, or did not work out well?
Our conclusion, which is tentative, right? We try to be very careful as researchers, is that it did not go as planned. So if we go back to the hearings in the Florida Congress, the argument for the adoption of this law were very straightforward, and I think they were like super solid arguments. The first argument was that, as you said, the newspapers, the print newspapers, are a dying industry. Almost no one reads them anymore, so maybe we should do things differently. And then the second argument was also cost savings. In order to publish things, legal notices in a newspaper, every single time you need to pay this advertising fee. So the Republican proponent of this law, the sponsor of the bill, calculated that Florida would save more than $200 million a year.
Wow.
By
So
moving
one of our readers writes in, thanks for listening, Reedman. Sneaky moves from sneaky leadership. Thanks you, Reedman. Appreciate that take.
It's funny. Yes. Exactly. So what was I going to say? Yes.
So you're saying the idea was it was going to save all that money. They calculated how much they got to save.
Save all this money. And what we need to keep in mind here is that the purpose of the government is not to save money. They should be doing things as effectively as they can for us, the constituencies, and not just saving money. So like what matters is whether this information, important information about upcoming actions of local governments actually reaches the constituents or not. And there were like concerns about that from the beginning. There were senators, both Republican actually and Democratic senators, who were concerned that the way the law was set up was perhaps suboptimal. So what they did in Florida is that they said, oh, you can either continue publishing your notices in newspapers, or you could throw it on one of the county's websites. And there's like, if you are located, say, in Miami-Dade counties, and you go to the Miami-Dade county website. And there was concern about basically this feasibility of acquisition of information. How many people would randomly go to the county website just to parse through public notices? And some people thought there were not many. Our paper is the first paper to actually study legal notices empirically. So we don't have much information to like research solid information to build on, but there are anecdotes of like great moments where public notices shined. And those moments usually had to do with someone reading a newspaper on a sunny Sunday and noticing, and that was the only way they could acquire information, noticing that something was about to happen in their city. For example, someone in New Mexico noticed that the oil drilling company was about to increase extraction. It was just like a notice about that. And while this might be good for the company or the entire economy of New Mexico, it was suboptimal for the constituents because there's often negative spillovers from drilling that they have to suffer from. And this is basically what's the first information acquisition point, after which the citizens organized and sort of against it. So it's like a success story. But all the success stories have to do with somewhat accidental discovery of information. Is it possible? The senators asked when those notices on the relatively obscure website of a county, not in the municipality itself. So that's what we try to understand in our study.
This is so interesting. We're talking to Anya Nakhmurina, who's a professor at Yale, at School of Management at Yale, who worked on the first paper really kind of looking at what's happened with legal notices in the United States and whether it matters whether this new movement to no longer require governments, to local governments and state governments to publish local legal notices will impact democracy.
Exactly.
And the working of government. So tell me more. So you looked at other states, how sometimes by accident people find out something at illegal notices, and then it really matters, like to whether they're going to live. And in Florida in 2023, they thought to save money and they could just effectively get information out by just using county websites. So you looked at, and so what did you find out? Did they save money? Were people as informed as before?
Yeah. One more detail, at the risk of sort of complicating the setting and convoluting it, but one detail that's very, very important to understand is that there's already a centralized website where newspapers had to send their public notices to after publication. There's one such website.
I never knew about that. What's it called?
It's called, very simply, Florida Public Notices.
Oh, in Florida.
And in Connecticut, there is a website called Connecticut Public Notices.
What percentage of people who live in Connecticut do you think know that this website exists? So I'm a reporter. I didn't know it exists. Do you think 0.1% of Connecticut knows that website exists?
That data is unavailable, so I can only give you an educated guess. I think some people might know that this exists, but probably not many. There was a research seminar I was giving at Duke, and there was this very famous professor. I was super scared of her, and she came to my talk, and she listened, and she said that she has a lot of relatives in Florida, and it is their hobby to go on that website. Well, at risk of characterizing this person, of course, I'm nerdy and she's nerdy, and I would expect her relatives to also be this way. So the answer would be probably some people go, but not a lot of them.
So this bill passed, became law.
Right.
Governor signed it. What did you find out in Florida? What happened?
We find several things. First, given the opportunity, municipalities move notices away from newspapers and onto county websites. And the effect is super big. There's like a 60% drop on average in some, I think it's a case of cities, right? So most of the cities move most of their notices onto county websites. That's the first result, right? So that's the incentive worked. And the second result that we have, and I'm very proud of this result because we use some creative methods to evaluate participation, but we look at the number of people that show up in public meetings. And we find out that this number goes down.
What kind of numbers did you come up with, and what kind of public meetings?
So what we did is we went on YouTube, and as you know, a lot of cities now are uploading their public meetings onto YouTube. And we downloaded all those videos, and we transcribed the videos into transcripts. And then we're like, this is very messy data. We don't know who's talking when, because the transcript is very unstructured. And then we decided that the way, like an elegant way to evaluate participation, is to count the number of the first names that is being pronounced in the meeting. If you've ever been to a public meeting, you would know that prior to commenting, you should introduce yourself. So I would say, hello the board, my name is Anya Nakhmurina, and I'm concerned about this tax increase that you are proposing. And then I would go in details about my concern, but my first name will register as the last name. My last name is very hard to pronounce and identify, and YouTube might not do a very good job of catching it. That's why focusing on unique first names is the way to evaluate participation. And
so you're defining participation as number of people who speak at a hearing online.
Yeah.
Okay. Because that's a little tricky. Because it might be of an issue where if everybody can find out they have an opportunity, they're motivated to come whether or not they have a personal stake in the issue or if they're against it. or very have some stake in being okay. We'll get beyond that.
Yeah.
So you found that
this is all fair.
democracy is tricky to turn.
This is all
data.
fair, but there's no
better alternative for data.
So there's no better alternative for data. If you think about it a little bit more, you'll realize that there's no reason why all those incentives that you were talking about would change with the passage of the law, right? So as long as it doesn't change this thing,
Right.
it is held
The
constant.
factor that changed was that there's no more legal notice in the newspaper.
Yeah.
So, and did you look at age at all? Because remember, no one reads a newspaper under 60 or 50. So, like,
We find stronger effects in places with a higher percentage of seniors, for sure.
Right.
So that's consistent with you.
so you did the data, and what did the data tell you? What numbers did you come up with?
I'm blanking. I think there was like 14% decrease in participation in a public meeting. Yeah, so that's a non-trivial number.
And then 23, when you start studying this, was the point at which governments now are vestigially continuing to be online sometimes because COVID restrictions have been lifted. I guess they're lifted sooner in Florida. And it became an issue again. Are you going to show up to a meeting, which is very hard to get people to, especially at night. But so your conclusion was that they took the legal notices out of the newspaper and fewer people showed up in meetings.
Exactly. Well, that's a fair concern. Can I respond to your concern?
Yeah.
So what Paul is saying is that, there were structural changes in how governments started to operate. They learned how to do online during the pandemic, and some of them may have continued to be online. There are some things that I did not mention about the way we do our analysis is that we compare, it has to do with the nature of the law. So the law says you should send your notices on a county website. And turns out that some counties prepared those websites ahead of the law, and some counties never had those websites throughout our sample period, which ends around 25. So we then compare the county, cities and other municipalities and counties that had an option to move with those that didn't have that option. So hopefully that alleviates this concern.
And what did you find out? What did you find out when you factored that in? Did the places where the county websites were set up, did they have more people participating?
No, this is just the basic design, the research design that we have, right? So we need...
Oh, you factored it in ahead of time so you wouldn't bias
Yeah.
in places that did or didn't have the county website.
Yeah, so
it'd be
all
apples
the
to-
effect that you can't move your notices on the county website when the county doesn't have a website.
Right.
So that's a control group,
And
right?
of course, in Connecticut state hearings now, so many more people testified than ever did before 2020 because
Right.
you could do it from your home online.
Right.
And that had a bigger impact than
Right.
websites because activist groups, tell you
Yeah.
when the stuff's up.
Yeah.
We're talking to Anya Nakhmurina about her really, really interesting, groundbreaking research on legal notices and what impact they have on participatory democracy. So what was your conclusion? Oh, what money? Did they save money?
On money, it's very hard for us to say because financial reports of local governments take usually more than a year to come out, so it's hard for us
To know whether they spent money. But
Yeah.
the idea was that they spent this money on legal notices. They don't have to spend many more. They
yes,
just put it on
that
the
was
website.
the idea, but I'm pretty sure they didn't have to spend that money, right? If we see this movement onto online, the county websites, and we see fewer newspaper notices, by definition, it means that they saved some money. But it turns out that they saved some money at a cost of fewer people participating in the meetings. And in fact, some of the more contentious and more popular meetings might not surprise you, listeners, and might not surprise you, Paul, are the meetings about planning and zoning. This is something that gets people worked up, and usually people have a lot of opinions.
And often the
about that.
reason someone might go to a planning and zoning hearing is not because they read illegal notices, but because you have to put in the window of the building, you have the zoning application for that the zoning hearing is coming. So if you actually live in that neighborhood, or if a neighbor has been involved, they have a management team, we call them in New Haven, or a block watch. that's often, or if the local news outlet covers these issues, they will tell you a hearing's coming up or it's been
Right. That is all possible.
Like when you looked in Florida, did you look in those communities when you saw whether participation went up or down? Did you take into account which communities had news outlets where they actually sent reporters to cover the meetings and the legislative bodies that were putting the legal notices?
I will say two things. First, I'm not sure the laws that we have here in Connecticut are the same as the laws that they have there in Florida. I have to be honest, I don't know if they have to put out the window information. I will need to learn that. That's
no, it's
a
okay.
great opportunity to learn.
You're doing God's work here. We're talking about public information here.
Yeah.
In Connecticut, what happened with the bill? I thought the bill didn't end up passing this session.
It did not, because the legislative session ended. They never got a chance to...
But it did have support. It got out of committee, right?
It went through the House, but it didn't pass the Senate.
And that would have said the same thing, that you could put it on your website.
Exactly. It would have said the same.
We're talking to Anya Nakhmurina, who's someone whose work people like me in the news business value so much, because we dedicate our lives to covering local news and we want people to be involved. In that context, would you mind if I gave you a devil's advocate perspective?
Oh, absolutely. I love that.
Because my whole life I've cared so much about people showing up to public meetings. The New Haven Independent, which is the news site affiliated with this radio station, it was founded 21 years ago because New Haven stopped having reporters going to public meetings. So we founded it specifically so people would show up to Board of Ed and zoning meetings, know about them, legislative hearings.
Oh, wonderful.
So that was all we were about. And I am 1,000% in favor of the law to not have legal notices in paid newspapers.
Great.
And I'll tell you why. A whole bunch of reasons. So at first we said, hey, we really care about participation, so we'll charge a quarter of what it costs to put you in a print newspaper to have a legal notice in our paper, and our online only paper. And in fact, because we cover these bodies, the people who would want to show up to the meetings in neighborhoods, they'll read us more likely. The governments couldn't do it because the letter of the law said it had to be a print newspaper. We actually had a probate judge go get a ruling that it was okay to do it in addition. So we have some government bodies, because we cover local news, they put their legal notices in us in addition to the print newspaper that doesn't cover these areas. So they spend 3 times as much for the unnecessary legal notice in the print paper, and then they'll spend a fraction on ours. And something we'll do, because print newspapers put legal notices in tiny type called agate, like on page 40, if they still have 40 pages anymore. We put on our front page, here's today's legal notice, go and read it. I would argue, based on our experience, and the reason they didn't change it, because this was 20 years ago and 15 years ago, legislators were scared of print newspaper editorials. And the people who owned print newspapers before, they were all bought by corporate chains that were no longer investing in local news. They were worried they would write an editorial against a legislator who was running for re-election. So if they were a vote against the money that was coming to that print newspaper, they thought they'd lose their job. So this was a government subsidy to print newspapers, often owned by conservative Republicans who would editorialize against misuse of public money, except when it comes to spending public money on legal notices in their newspapers. So that's how that happened until recently. What has changed even more is the way people get information. So in my experience covering government, the thing that makes people go to a hearing is if they know about the issue. So when people show up to a zoning hearing, I don't think it's usually because of legal notices. It's their neighborhood website. They're all, like in New Haven, we have alders. Like in Ward 25 in Westville and Ward 7 and Ward 9 in East Rock, the alders, every time there's something in the neighborhood hearing, they will send information to all their constituents that's coming up. If somebody's been in a management team or local neighborhood group. So there's all these new ways that didn't exist. We had print legal notices when that was the best, most efficient way to reach people who might want to either bid on contracts, which is important too, or show up at public meetings. We now have infinitesimally more direct and efficient ways of reaching people than before. And then when government gets its word out, I know so people don't look at the website. I would argue that when you look at the numbers, more people look at government websites than buy physical print newspapers. What it came to later in the last 10 years was all these print newspapers got bought up by chains. So most of the local dailies that still exist really don't have reporters who go to the local meetings 99% of the time. But they're owned by the Hearst Corporation or Alden Capital, which is getting rid of all the staff and just, and this becomes a subsidy for them to stay in business. And I would argue that eliminates the competition, that unfairly tilts the scales of competition for what kind of news media evolves. Because all over the country, 1,000 local news, often nonprofit, online only, have sprung up to actually cover local government, while legacy print papers are owned by chains who want to milk all the money they can without recovering their community. When governments give them an inefficient, expensive requirement for government to put their legal notices there, they're keeping those people in business, because private equity firms have bought these local newspapers to drain all the value out of them, strip them for parts, but still make profits on legacy revenues, which include legal notices. So I would argue that government, by putting those legal notices in the print newspapers, you will reach some people who are 60 and 70 who might come to a meeting. But in general, you're propping up unfairly, and you come from Russia, so you understand about crony capitalism, state capitalism. They're propping up nefarious corporations that are driving people away from participating in public life by eliminating local coverage of news and unfairly keeping them in business when you can instead be supported. So that was my original idea. I should support the local nonprofit news outlets, because also with legal notices. But then I realized we cover that stuff. That's how people find out about it. And it would save the government money. Like, so if one reason for legal notices is to compete for contracts. If you're a contractor, you knew to go to the back of that newspaper. So you can know to go to the government website. New Haven, they do know to go to the website, say the purchasing department. So that's a specialized group. And I am skeptical that anybody ever goes to a public meeting in New Haven for the last 15 years because of a tiny print legal notice in the back of the print paper. So I think that even though it would make me more money to change the law to say, well, you can do a print or an online only, but a genuine news outlet. I don't want government deciding what's a legitimate news outlet. And the definition of what is news has evolved so much that there are influencers and advocacy groups and email listservs that reach so many more people in a targeted way, that so much more efficiently get them to public meetings, that I think it's actually a negative to require government to publish legal notices in corporate-owned legacy newspapers.
Okay.
So I'm sorry about that speech. This is like,
this is an exciting speech.
I love what you're doing, Anya, and I know you're on the side of the angels and you've studied it much more than I have. This is just my grunt, very local in the pond perspective.
Right. You would be a bit surprised, but we agree on most things in what you've said. I
know. I can tell.
The first, my headline response would be, those are all the arguments against us finding the results, right? The empirical exercises we did speaks otherwise, and that's what we report. We looked at the traffic at county websites, and we didn't find any changes on the traffic. This is sort of in defense of the result and in defense of the paper. At the same time, I'm in complete agreement with you that it doesn't seem that the current regime, print newspapers or online newspapers in Florida, they allow both prior.
Oh, they do?
Yes. That would actually work in the current day and age. So in the olden days, all people could do to consume information, like the news about big events in the world and the small events in their local communities, was to go to the newspaper. And you can imagine, could someone on a Sunday was just flipping through the newspaper, accidentally see this information, and that what kind of triggers all the consequent actions, including coming to the board meeting. But in a current day and age, the way the newspapers, even the online versions of newspapers, are structured is a dynamic page. It always changes, right? And it learns what I like to read, and perhaps it shows me tailored information and shows you slightly different information. So it's actually a super interesting problem that I appreciate you guys trying to solve, right? So
It's also an
how do we-
opportunity.
Exactly.
Now that why don't we find the ways that the information is tailored to people who would care about community, live in a community,
Yeah.
live in a neighborhood, follow certain things. We can get them the stuff better.
Exactly. And how do we do that? And we also want perhaps to reach people who are not the most active in a community. Because I agree with you, people who are super active will find the ways to learn about this, right?
So where I find where people,
Uh-huh.
the way I even came up with online journalism was reading in 2005 a blog in New Jersey where there was a fire drill in Montclair, New Jersey. And on a blog, it wasn't journalism. They said there's a fire drill, everyone's outside. And someone wrote in, boy, the old days we did things so much better. We didn't have these fire drills. Somebody wrote, no, you're just a racist. Now they're black kids. You're seeing them outside. When we were all white kids, we also did the fire drills.
That escalated quickly.
And then they went back inside. They said, now we report everyone's back inside. And someone said, I'm a teacher back inside. You know what's more important than fire drills? I can't breathe in this building because they built it so badly. There's no ventilation. And somebody else wrote, I just moved to Montclair. This is interesting. When's the next Board of Ed meeting? And what I took from that is that when you look at a legal notice, they are very clinical. They're very dry. If you're not already interested and you say RM2 zoning application to do a variance on Whaley Avenue, you're not going to say, they're putting a smoke shop on Whaley Avenue. But if you have local reporting that said we've had problems with smoke shops and now they're putting that one there, or someone's license with parking, we don't have parking for Zanelli's on Wooster Street. So I would argue that it's local reporting that gets the people there. I'll give you an example just from Jersey City, New Jersey, a couple weeks ago. There was a mayor who was voted out of office and he tried to give a developer friend who gave him a lot of money, all this money for a project that was never built. And the reporter who monitors agendas that have to be put online noticed that it was too late for them to put a notice in a print newspaper. They said in 24 hours, which is the minimum notice, they're going to have an emergency meeting before this mayor leaves office to give, basically, because the reporter covers it, noticed that it meant they were trying to get this money to this developer, even though the project was never going to be built. Only because the reporter saw that. He published it on an online local news site that isn't owned by a big corporation. And people turned out to the meeting the next day and it got killed.
Right.
And they saved millions of dollars.
I'm not going to argue.
No, of course you're going to argue. Of course you're going to agree that that's great. I don't know if a legal notice in a print newspaper would have had that impact.
Yeah, I don't know either. I'm not going to argue that local journalism is not important. Right?
Of course.
It's a
why
huge concern of the modern day, and that is becoming harder and harder and harder of local journalists to do their work. It could be that. So when we were trying to learn more about institutional details, and I'm curious what you think about this. And we talked to a few journalists in Florida, and they say, "Oh, like part of my job is this boring administrative job when I get like an inflow of public notices." And I have to parse through them to publish them, just reformat and publish them either online or in print. And sometimes I come across something that catches my attention as sort of the first step for me to investigate something. So it could be that the journalists are not doing this administrative work anymore, and through that we observe our effects, but the effect is all the same.
Well, there used to be bodies at these local newspapers that covered agendas. So at The Independent, everyone who writes follows the agendas of all the agencies they cover, and they look in advance what's coming up to see what's coming. That's what reporters do. I think we agree about that. So bottom line, bottom line, you don't want to see states pass laws that no longer require. You don't want Connecticut next section to pass the law that would no longer require local legal sources in news outlets.
I think the way I would answer it is, I want the state legislature to think hard about how to design the delivery of those notices to the constituents. What the Connecticut legislature did this year is basically so similar to Florida, and we show that there are some negative effects in Florida on democratic participation. So maybe they can learn from that and think of a law that would actually benefit.
So this is very interesting. I'm wondering, given that it's what news has changed. What is a news organization? It's a much broader definition. and you're getting tricky First Amendment territory when you try to say some aren't or aren't. Like a lot of the investigative reporting that I like in Connecticut is done by a right-wing outlet whose politics I hate. But I feel like it's very honestly done, the perspective they're coming from. And a lot of it's about FOI. I don't know if they would qualify under a legal notice. And also, when you look at how many people click on a website, that's tricky because the metrics are so inflated or based on bots of when people go to stuff. And if 5 people were to go and not be measured as an increase, but they might be the 5 who show up.
Yeah, those are all tricky.
So I wonder whether your call is really interesting here, that the legislature be more thoughtful about it next year and really look at what's going to be the best way in the 21st century to reach people through legal notices and accomplish the goal of what previous legislation has been to require legal notices in print newspaper, and maybe look at where people getting their news and find a way to force government to do that, maybe a best practices.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting policy design question, which I honestly don't have a good answer to.
But you're the only one who started to look at it in any empirical way.
Yes. So we show that the way Florida did it, perhaps not optimal, right? But what is the right way to do that? That's a very hard question. I keep thinking about that question and I had some ideas, but there's no way for me to test those ideas.
Well, I'm encouraged that there's someone as smart as you who can actually do this for a living and look at it. So I'm going to be looking forward to what you come up with, Anya. Let me just ask you how you got into this. When you moved from Russia to U.S. 11 years ago?
Yes.
Did that story have anything to do with your interest in this topic?
No. No. At the time I was working, my story is sort of interesting. So I was studying in Moscow in this Masters of Economics program. New Economic School is like a private place. There's not a lot of private places in Russia, and they sort of try to replicate the PhD level curriculum there, and it was very enjoyable for me to study that, but I also burned out big time. So part of me wanted to continue studying econ or finance and go on with my graduate studies, but part of me was like, I'm so tired, I don't know what to do, maybe I should get some experience. And I got some interesting work experience. I worked in a bank, and then I worked in venture capital, and I saw that that was what I'm interested in. But of course, Russia is so notoriously known of like governmental inefficiency, and things just don't work. So like this is just something that interested me as a citizen, and it had this super rosy view of the US, which I think is mostly true, but there are some caveats. I worked in venture capital, and I was like always looking at the US companies that were servicing people in like best, most efficient ways, and like at the time back in 2013, it seemed to me it's like a modern, very well developed country that's full of opportunities. Most of it is true, but when I arrived here, I arrived in the city of Chicago, I started learning more about how the city operates, and apparently
Chicago's a good one to start with.
Yeah, and I was just shocked that some of the problems that Chicago was facing and some of the surrounding places were facing actually very, very similar to the problems that municipalities in Russia are facing. With perhaps one exception is like it's a little bit less centralized here. There's more democracy and there's more decision making that is given to municipalities themselves, and that excited me. Right, because this is a place where there's a lot of data, I can obtain this data, I can look at the incentives. It's interesting how like incentives always work in a similar way, right? I can look at similarities and the different, and I didn't want to study that at all, but like just a sequence of news reading attracted me to that.
Well, I'm so glad you did that, but I want to have you come back, not just to tell me more about that, but I also want to hear about investment banking and flow of information there.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that.
So maybe we'll get you back. Okay, well, Anya Nakhmurina, thanks for being such a great sport coming on air with us. And when I had mixed up what days you were coming, I thought it was great
No
to talk to you.
problem. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Your research is fascinating. It's important. I'm glad you're on the front lines about how we're going to look at laws that are designed to inform and enable people to participate in government. I think it's a great journey you're on. And thanks also for taking devil's advocate questions.
Oh, thank you for questioning me.
Thanks for Harry Droz behind the controls. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It'd Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.